Okay, so before we go into the actual game turns and activations and so forth, I needed to cover a couple of things. One is we want to cover the stat cards for each model and how to review a stat card quickly and find information that you need in a clear manner. As well as after that, we're going to go over just one example activation. And once that is done, hopefully we can move on to how the game is actually played. And when you guys are watching how the game is actually played, I'm going to go very fast, and I'm going to apologize up front for that. But if you're watching this part and the previous parts with the duels, then hopefully some of that stuff will stick, and you'll get to see it all in one flowing motion. So that's the attempt anyways. We'll see how it actually plays out. So for the stat cards, each model has its own stat card. You can see we're going to look at Mysterious here. And the stat cards are broken into a few different areas. So the first area up here is the top, which is the cost of the model in soulstones, or it's the cash if we're talking about a master. Again, masters are free, so you're looking at that number up top for a master when you're looking at how many soulstones you are going to begin with when you hire that master. The top two black bars are what I call the body bars. Now these are the statistics that are really just the base model itself, without not considering its weapons or its armor or anything like that. Basically, its body. So you've got, starting here in the top left, you've got WK, which is walk in inches, and then slash charge. Charge takes up 2 actions, so that's the distance the model moves when it makes a charge, and that would also include a melee strike if the model ends up within its melee range. So you've got walk, charge, then you've got the height of the model. The comparative heights of models are important when you're determining line of sight, randomizing hits into combat, and certain spell effects only affect certain heights of models. Next to that, you have the willpower stat. Most commonly, willpower is used to resist spells or resist certain attacks, but there are occasionally models that use their willpower in an offensive manner. Now, going over the bottom half of the bar, you've got your CA, or your casting value of the model. So when this model is casting a spell, it begins with a CA of 4 RAM. Now, suits are very important too, because suits are required often when casting spells. So you will need those stats as well, and there are some models in the game that can actually take those suits away from you, so you have to be careful about that. Next to cast is the DF, or defense of the model. This is the stat that's going to be used most often when this model is the target of a melee or a ranged strike, or an attack spell that targets defense. And then finally you have WD, or wounds. This is the number of wounds a model can sustain before it is killed. And you have the wound stat up here, and then you also have these bullet marks here on the side so that you can mark down how many wounds the model has taken. So the top 2 bars are the body, what I call the body bars of the model. And then the middle two vertical bars here are the model's weaponry. So the middle 2 vertical bars are the weapons of the model. So you can see I have a Peacebringer blade here, and the RG is the range of the weapon. So you can see the range of the weapon in inches, so it's a range 1, and you see that little claw mark there? That's to denote that this is a melee weapon. The CB is the combat rating of that weapon, or the starting value that the model begins with before it flips a card. So on an attack, it's going to add flip a card and add the value of 5 in the case of the Peacebringer blade. And I'll point out why that CB is marked in red in a minute here. Then at the bottom, you have this DG statistic. This is the damage of the weapon, and the damage is rated in 3 different categories: weak, moderate, and severe, going left to right. So the weak damage of the Peacebringer blade is 2, the moderate is 3, and the severe is 4. So when you're flipping cards for damage, depending on what card you have to take, you will be doing weak, moderate, or severe damage. The Peacebringer on the right vertical bar is the model's ranged weapon, and it has an RG of 10 or 10 inches. A little gun icon there means it's a ranged weapon. It's important to note that whenever you see that gun icon, that means that two things in general. It means that this weapon cannot be used while the model is engaged in melee. And when I say engaged, that means if this model is within the melee range of another model, or then it cannot use its ranged attacks. And it has a CB also of 5 RAM. Now it's important to note that there's a 5 RAM on the gun, but it's only a 5 on the Peacebringer blade, and we'll get to that in a second, like I said. Note that both stats are colored in red, so we'll go over that as well. And the damage is 2, 3, 5. So that's the weak, moderate, and severe of the Peacebringer blade. So, body bar, weaponry, and note that not all models have 2 weapons. Some models are only sporting 1 weapon, but a lot of models do have 2, just so you know. Now down here you have this section called abilities. Now abilities are things that are passive. In other words, they happen all the time. They apply to the model at all times, and it's not you don't have to spend actions to do things like hard to wound 1, intractable, is a death marshal, slow to die, or fear not death. These things apply based on their descriptions on the back, and they're always in play. One other thing I forgot to point out is there are categories or characteristics of models listed under the name of the model. For example, this is a Death Marshal. Death Marshals have special rules. They can be buffed by certain abilities that buff Death Marshals. You may see other things like, for example, you might see Undead on some of the models, or Construct. Bell is another characteristic, meaning that there are certain buffs and things that apply to bells. So anyways, so I thought I would just show that real quick. So you've got your abilities here, which are always in play. And then you have spells and actions. Now notice that the spells have a number in parentheses. That is the number of action points required to attempt that spell. So, for example, if Mysterious here wanted to finish the job, she would have to spend one of her actions to cast this spell, and then we would go through the casting cost, the resist, and the range, just as we did when we were doing the resist duel example. You'll see that also she has another spell here called Pine Box. This is a 2-action spell, so this is going to take both of her general AP or action points to cast this spell as well. Other models kind of have general actions that they can take that aren't spells. And looking at our example here, I am hard-pressed to find one. Wait, here's one. We'll look at Judge here for a second. Judge has a 2-action here called Flurry. This is not a spell. This is a general action that the Judge can attempt to discard a card and make 3 melee attacks on the same target. The description of these abilities are included in the general rules manual, so you can always reference those. So you'll have, for example, you'll have actions and you'll have spells. One other thing that I would point out is that certain models have zero abilities. So see this spell here called Call Bell? There's a 0 in parentheses there. That means that this model can cast this spell or take whatever action is associated with that 0 in addition to its 2 general action points. So in the case of Madame Sibel here, she can walk twice, or she can attack once and walk once, and she can always do this Call Bell because it's her only 0 action available. The only exception to that is if the model has an action point modifier, such as Instinctual, that would give her 2 0 actions that she can perform, and they must be different. Or if there is an All ability. Anytime you see an All ability, next to a spell or an ability, that means that's going to use up the model's entire activation, including all of its AP, which includes the 2 general AP, any 0 actions that it might have been able to take, and any plus actions that it might have been able to take. Now, so in general, a model can take 2 actions during its activation, but some models have what I just mentioned are action modifiers. So, for example, if I'm looking at Sheamus here, you can see he's a master, so he has a bunch of different abilities there at the bottom. He's got this ability here called +1 fast. Now, +1 fast is +1 general AP. So instead of taking 2 general actions, Sheamus can take up to 3. He has an assortment of different 0 actions he can take, but he can only take 1 of those 0 actions, even if he only took 2 general actions. In other words, he can't turn in one of his general action points to take a second 0 action. Another example of a action modifier would be like Lady Justice here. Whoa. If it comes into focus, hope it does. Well, I'll read it to you and see if it eventually comes into focus. But Lady Justice has this +1 melee expert down here. So this is an action modifier that she can take. It's an additional action that Lady Justice can take during her activation to make a melee strike. Obviously that means that she needs to be in melee to take the additional action, but if she is, then she does get the additional action. Now, back to Mysterious here for a second. Now, I mentioned that I was going to cover these red colored in stats. Now, anytime you see a stat that's colored in, and it doesn't have to be red, it can sometimes be green. In the case of Resurrectionists, it can be blue in the case of Arcanists. But anytime you see a colored in stat here, this means that it's associated with a specific trigger. And triggers have to do with the suits played when that particular stat is called upon. So, for example, both of these CBs are in red, and they correspond to a trigger here called Critical Strike or Final Repose. Now you can see the Critical Strike there is ghosted out, like I pointed out before, because it does exist on the Peacebringer ranged attack. However, it does not exist on the Peacebringer blade. So if you were using the Peacebringer blade and you happen to have the CB attack card that you played was a ram, then you would get the Critical Strike trigger or the Final Repose trigger. But otherwise, you don't get Critical Strike on the Peacebringer blade. Now so you can see triggers here normally start with the stat that the trigger applies to, CB in this case. Then it will have the suit requirement in parentheses, and then it will have the trigger, the name of the trigger, which is then explained on the back side of the card. The thing to note about triggers is that you may only declare 1 trigger per duel. In other words, when you flip a card and I flip a card and it's an opposed duel, and let's say I did get that ram, I was using my Peacebringer blade and I did get that ram in play, I now have a decision to make. Do I declare Critical Strike if I win the duel, or do I declare Final Repose? Because I can't declare both. Now, the one thing that often confuses people is where if a trigger grants an additional strike or an additional duel, for example, do you get to declare a new trigger on that new duel? And the answer is yes. And this becomes a very powerful loop in Malifaux. For example, I'm going to show Lady Justice Sword Style here. So if she casts Sword Style, for example, she can give herself a new trigger here called Onslaught. After damaging defender with a Greatsword Strike, immediately make a Greatsword Strike against the defender. So in other words, with her CB of 7 ram, you can see the ram is ghosted out there. CB 7 ram, and if she has a mask in play, let's say she had an 11 mask as her attack card, she can declare this trigger Onslaught if she successfully damages the defender. So what's interesting is if she fails to damage the defender, she can't declare Onslaught. The opposite of that would be she hits the defender, she causes damage with the mask on her CB, and then you go into a new duel, you flip new cards, and let's say that the next card is also a mask. Well, she gets to declare onslaught again. In other words, it's a potentially, it's an almost infinite number of attacks if she were to have a endless supply of masks in play, and she successfully has this trigger in play. So triggers become very important in Malifaux, and it's very important to pay attention to your triggers. So that's the basics of reading a card. Again, the two black bars on the top, body bars, then the vertical bars are your weaponry, then down here abilities, which are always in play, triggers, spells, and actions. Okay, so now we're going to talk about activations, and I'm going to go over a single activation with you. At the start of the turn, both players flip for initiative, and the player that wins that initiative flip gets to activate one of their models first. Malifaux is an alternating activations game, meaning when it's your turn to go, you're going to activate one of your models that has not yet activated this turn, perform all of its actions, and then it moves over to the other player, who may then activate any one of their unactivated models. There are certain exceptions to this, such as Companion or other abilities that allow models to activate in tandem, but for the purposes of explaining how an activation works, we're not going to cover that. So, going back to the card, I'm going to, let's just say it's the guild player's turn, I'm going to activate Mysterious here. Now, the thing to note is that all models have a base of 2 action points. In general, there are a couple of exceptions, like summon models, or models affected by slow or fast. But for purposes of this explanation, we're going to say that all models have a base of 2 actions. So, like I said previously, a walk is 1 action. So I can walk that many inches at the cost of 1 action. I can make a strike with one of my weapons as another action, or I can do a spell as another action, or any combination as long as they add up to 2. So for example, for Mysterious, let's say it's her turn, she can take 1 action to move forward, and then she can take another action to perform a ranged strike, if she wanted to shoot at Sibel, for example. Or she could take 1 action to walk forward, and 1 action to walk forward again. Or, if assuming she was in range, she could take 2 actions just to fire. That's the basics of it. 2 actions. 1 walk, 2 walks, or 1 walk, 1 attack, 2 walks, or 2 attacks. Or 1 walk and 1 interact, for example. So like if the bell went, the bell could walk up to this center marker here as 1 action. Then she could activate that marker as a 2nd action. It generally doesn't matter what order you do your actions, unless you are doing something like defensive stance that has to be declared as your first action no matter what. So that's the basics of it. In addition, like I pointed out with Madame Sibel, she can do a 0 action in addition to those 2 actions. So she can walk up twice, for example, and then she can cast her 0 action spell. So on your turn, you go through 1 model. Once your turn to go, you do 1 model. You do both of its activation or both of its actions. Then it goes to the other player. They activate one of their unactivated models. Do both of its general actions and end its turn. And then this goes back and forth until there are no more models left in play. In situations where a player still has models to activate after one player has run out of models, that player may continue to activate unactivated models until he also runs out of models to activate. And that would end the turn. So that's it for a model's basic activation. You'll see this kind of in fast forward when we're walking through a full game turn.